Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us on track one. Next up, we have Shelby Cunningham. She's going to be presenting reducing ratio of reserved but public CVEs. Shelby, take it away.
Thank you so much. All right, sounds like the mic is working. Everyone can hear me okay? All right, sounds good. Well, thank you everyone for coming to my talk on reserved but public CVEs. While we're waiting for folks to get back from cookies and fruit and beverages, I figured I would start the presentation by going over the definition of reserved but public slide. This is the driest part, I promise, but I want to double check that I've established some ground rules for what we're talking about. And the glossary page says that that a reserved but public CVE is a little bit different from just a reserved CVE. Reserved but public means that it's in the reserved state, but information about that CVE ID has been made public somewhere. This is different from CVEs that have been reserved, but they're not assigned yet, or CVEs that weren't used at all and that need to be rejected. So this is something that should be on the CVE list. It's not there yet, even though the information is out there. And the CVE program gets a little bit cranky when people have too many CVEs that are in this reserved but public state, because it's not great for the usability of the CVE list. And who am I, and why is this something that I know anything about? As we established earlier, my name is Shelby Cunningham. I am a curator for GitHub's advisory database. You can come visit me at github.com/ShelbyC to get a taste of what I do for a living. But as part of the advisory curation team who works with GitHub's advisory database, one of the things that I do is some of the work associated with a CVE Numbering Authority. I issue CVE IDs to vulnerabilities that come in via a repository GitHub security advisory. If maintainers come to GitHub and they want a CVE, I am one of the people who will look at that request, and I can decide whether or not to assign based on the rules. In addition, and this is probably what GitHub is largely more known for, I review other CNA CVE IDs for inclusion in the GitHub Advisory Database. GitHub CVEs and other CNA CVE IDs will both have the opportunity to end up in the database if it's in one of the ecosystems that GitHub supports. And at the end of every year, I deal with my org's excess CVE IDs. I deal with rejecting them and making sure there's not anything that's been forgotten. And I deal with it with when other orgs have CVE IDs that need to be rejected or have been forgotten throughout the year. In fact, this talk is the story of how a CVE rejection project at the end of an old year and the beginning of a new year grew way beyond its original scope and resulted in me having to update a lot of CVE information. If you use the GitHub Advisory Database in any capacity, this screen is likely very familiar to you. This is what it looks like, not today, but this is what it looked like when I submitted the slides for inclusion in the presentation. And if you attended my colleague John Maroney's talk yesterday, he went over quite a bit of information about the GitHub Advisory Database, and I encourage you to watch it whenever it becomes available online. But this is what it looks like. When John and I first started about 3 years ago, there were fewer than 5,000 advisories in the database. And as of now, there are over 17,000. So we've worked with a lot of CVE information, both our own and other organizations. And we've learned a lot over the past 3 years, but to really understand how I got into the position of understanding reserved but public CVEs and the importance of keeping that information on the CVE list published, we're going to have to go back a little bit further to my career before GitHub. Before joining GitHub, I was an employee of a record label distro, store, online shop, and before COVID, a live music venue called Get Hip Recordings in Pittsburgh, where I am from. And I started there full time in January of 2020, and until I joined GitHub in March of 2021. And in case folks weren't aware, there are some just little things that happened in 2020 that made it really hilarious to be an essential worker working for a small business, which is very it was an exciting job. And I'm going to have stories from that job for the rest of my life. But like a lot of people, I had a service industry job where I had to deal with customers. I had to deal with shipping stuff. I had to deal with B2B sales. It's a small business, so I wore a lot of hats. But I'm probably not the only person in this room who had a service sector job before having the job I do now. If any of you have ever worked something like customer service or having to deal with stuff coming in from the public, right, raise your hands. I think, yeah. So that seems like that's a fairly common thing to have worked service sector and not just be dealing with computers your whole life. In fact, if you're an eagle-eyed viewer, you can probably notice that my GitHub icon picture is of me at Get Hip Records in the summer of 2020. It looks really nice and professional whenever it's in tight, but when you expand the full picture, it's pretty clear where I am and what I'm doing. But if I called this talk, I used to work at a record store, it wouldn't have gotten accepted. So I pulled a sneaky on VolnCon. But the premise sounds a little bit dry, but it's actually a really good and heartwarming story about some interesting projects and learning and growing in my career. So the record store, what does this have to do with dealing with RBP CVEs at GitHub? And I'm glad you asked. So first of all, there are some similarities in the orgs. GetHip is a small business with a single-digit number of employees at any given time, and even fewer of those employees are full-time. The two core full-time employees are the owner and founder, Greg Kostelich, and his wife, Barbara Garcia Bernardo. And other than that, it's a rotating cast of colorful characters from whom I learned many things over the years. And the business relies almost entirely on manual processes in Microsoft Access for everything. It's a bespoke Microsoft Access system coded by Barbara's brother 20 years ago, and those manual processes are still used for everything. Adding products, adding new customer records, keying in orders, processing sales, everything. Everything goes through this MS Access database. And that's especially challenging when, as in late 2019, when I first considered coming on board at GetHip, when your boss is a touring musician who, on top of running a record label and dealing with artists, is himself a working musician and who goes out on tour and who leaves the business for long stretches of time and kind of lets things go. This is especially the case toward the end of 2019 because my predecessor at GetHip had left and things just by and large did not get done toward the end of 2019. So of course I come on board and we think, oh boy, it's a new year, it's 2020. We're going to finally deal with this big old pile of papers right here, full of sales records from 2019 that never got processed. And that had to be processed for a number of reasons. Well, that all had to be recorded manually, which was a bit tough. And that was my first big project when I came on board at GetHip. But eventually, I started to clear through the records, but this bitty little thing happened in March 2020 that some of you might remember that kind of sort of disrupted what we were doing at the business. And some of my colleagues did not come into the warehouse anymore for reasons. So this fell onto Greg, who was the owner. So ultimately the buck stopped with him and me because Barbara wasn't there. Barbara's mother had passed away in February of 2020. Barbara's mother lived in Spain. And this resulted in Barbara being stuck in Spain, quarantining alone for months on end, with just me and Greg there to deal with this big old pile of papers alongside everything else that happened at GitHub. But the backlog was causing some problems as 2020 wore on. There are a couple of things. The big one is that customers would attempt to order items that weren't in stock anymore because we had to do a manual sales process in order to update the inventory. So if the inventory wasn't updated, someone could still see we had one of an item and try to order it, even though that item might have been sold days or weeks or months ago. This also resulted in some issues in 2020 with dealing with taxes because all of those records had to be processed in order to have accurate sales information to provide to the IRS. So this did eventually end up helping me out at GitHub. It's not just a fun story about the business surviving the pandemic. It was a great job, but eventually I had to move on. And I did move on to GitHub in March of 2021. When I originally joined GitHub in March of 2021, it was a small team. There were only 2 curators responsible for all of the tasks related to the advisory database and all of our obligations as a CNA. It was John and me, plus our then manager. And on top of that, the advisory curation team changed managers at the same time. We were dealing with an itty bitty little thing in December 2021 called Log4Shell. So this is a tiny team dealing with a very serious issue that was very challenging, not just to our organization, but to a lot of organizations similar to ours. And we had to prioritize what to do. Do you see where I'm going with this one? So if that sounds familiar, that's because it should be. As 2020 wore on for GitHub, things got pretty busy because, as it turns out, when you sell records online and people can't physically go to stores anymore, or they can't buy records from their favorite bands at a show, they tend to buy them online. And we had to prioritize getting the records shipped out because the business had to make money and we had to pay our bills. The business got no PPP aid. That was the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses, but they applied and never got it. So our only option was to keep plugging ahead and make sure the business could survive, which led to more of this. We prioritized the important parts, but eventually that backlog of work came due and it had to be dealt with. Once again, how do we relate this back to GitHub and RBP CVEs? So the team in 2021 to 2022 was small and spread pretty thin. Lower priority tasks like rejecting unused CVEs or dealing with reserved but public CVEs fell through the cracks because we were dealing with stuff that was arguably more important. We had to issue CVEs, we had to publish CVEs that were getting more attention, we had to publish advisories that were getting more attention. And on top of that, everything that we did on the advisory database team was a manual process until 2022, and a human had to double check everything. We still make sure things are handled by humans in order to make sure the information is quality and we're not publishing things we shouldn't, and we are publishing things we should, but it's a little bit different when you have humans checking something using more automated processes versus everything being manual. And even after Log4j mostly resolved, we had to onboard some teammates. We had a new manager in early 2022, so a lot happened all at once that meant that backlogs formed and stuff had to wait. At that time, until late 2022, everything CVE related was handled in a spreadsheet. which we had to go manually check if we ever wanted to update a record or add a record or anything like that. It all happened in this spreadsheet. And at the end of 2022, I took a look at the spreadsheet before it went away and thought, with this new automated tooling we have, we're going to have some extra time. And with that extra bandwidth, maybe we should clean up some stuff that fell through the cracks. So at the end of 2022, I took on rejecting GitHub's unused CVEs at the end of the year for the first time, which I thought was going to be a lot more straightforward than it actually was. And the project grew and grew and grew because there were things that had fallen through the cracks that I didn't notice or I didn't remember throughout the year and a half at that point that I had been there. And when I checked the spreadsheet, I discovered there were a number of CVEs that had information about them made public, but because that spreadsheet was pretty manual, they just fell through the cracks because if you didn't see something manually on the spreadsheet, it wasn't likely to pop up again. And once again, coming back to this idea of a reserved but public CVE, the project's original scope of manually rejecting CVEs ended up growing into publishing everything that had been made public before automatic tooling was available. It was relatively straightforward to reject the CVEs that needed to be rejected that were from before that tooling was available, but publishing was a little bit more involved. So why did I take on this project? Why was I worried in the first place? And why should all of you be worried? The big thing to worry about when you have reserved but public CVEs is making sure that the data you are providing to the CVE list is timely and relevant. The sooner CVE information makes it to the CVE list, the sooner that information will be ingested by downstream users, and the sooner it can be acted upon. If you let information sit for longer than necessary, that delays action that users can take to protect themselves. Similarly, we couldn't let packages sit around forever at the record store, and we couldn't let those sales records sit around forever because folks would start to order stuff that wasn't there. Related is data transparency. The whole CVE system is reliant on being transparent with your vulnerability information. Transparency is how we in the CNA community build trust with our users. If you don't have transparent information, it's also ties into timeliness. If you don't have timely and transparent information, if a record says reserved, how do you know it's reserved? How do you know that there isn't some vulnerability information hiding behind that reserved record? How do you know if it's supposed to be rejected or if it's supposed to be public? There's a lot of wondering that's involved when the information isn't timely and public. And in order to maximize the usefulness of the CVE list, it's really important to make that data transparent. If you do eventually make that information public, that can result in deluges when everyone gets the same idea all at the same time. If you've ever worked ingesting vulnerability information during the holidays at the end of the year, this gets very apparent very quickly when folks have realized that the year is coming to a close and they need to get their vulnerability information out there because they've been sitting on it for a while. I'm not saying don't get the information out there if it needs to get out there, but it does make things a little bit difficult for those folks who are covering for their colleagues around the holidays. Additionally, many orgs have deployment freezes around certain times of the year, like the holidays, which even if they do ingest vulnerability information, those freezes can delay the speed with which they can protect themselves. And of course, no one wants to deal with an incident during the holidays if something ends up being important. Pretty similar to this, which I was dealing with in December 2019, January 2020. Just like sales records leading to inaccurate inventory and tax information, don't let delayed CVE records lead to inaccurate vulnerability and patching information. Additionally, if you get your information out there in a faster and more timely fashion, You can help prevent other CNAs unknowingly assigning a duplicate CVE. It happens. Sometimes CNAs have overlapping scopes, and if you're not communicating with that other CNA, it's possible for duplicates to happen. It's possible to fix a duplicate. If you have a good relationship with that other CNA, it can be done, but it's work. In the CVE world, you have two options when it comes to generating a CVE record. You can do it right, or you can do it right the second time. And if there is an error, it's just not that it's a bad thing to find errors and fix them, but if you can prevent an error from happening, it's just less work for everyone in the long run. Right. And finally, if you let CVE information sink for too long without getting onto the CVE list or some other reliable source of information, that can increase the odds of link rot or other information loss. This is something that my team encountered when going through old CVE records, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years old. And if you went to the reference links, sometimes that information was just gone. The CVE record was the only live link that discussed that. There are resources like archive.org that are invaluable for finding additional information, but if the website that your report is on dies, who's going to know about the CVE if it's not in a place that's long-term stable and that can be counted on to be live in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And finally, the new rules say so. My team spent hours and hours individually and in a marathon meeting going through the new CVE CNA rules, and it was worth it because there were these two gems that are really, really important if you're sitting on some reserved but public CVEs and need a good reason to get them public. The new but not yet final CNA rules say 4.5.1.4 CNAs must publish a CVE record to the CVE list within 72 hours of publicly disclosing a CVE ID assigned by the CNA. If the CNA does not publish within 72 hours, then the CNA's route may direct the appropriate CNA of last resort to publish a CVE record for the assigned ID. Your initial reaction might be, oh, that's great. What's the problem? Someone's going to do it for me. This is fantastic. This means that if you don't publish the CVE record within 72 hours, the CVE record gets taken away from your CNA. It's not that someone else does the work for you. Additionally, 4.5.1.6, CNAs should publish CVE records within 72 hours of becoming aware that a CVE ID assigned by the CNA has been publicly disclosed by a party other than the CNA. At that point, if your CNA loses control over the content of the CVE record, that can increase the odds of some incorrect information being part of the record. And once again, this comes back to the saying that when you have a CVE record, you can do it right or you can do it right the second time. There is room for correction, but when misinformation gets out there, it can be out there, and it's more work to go back and correct an error than it is to just get it right in the first place. So, some techniques to minimize the accumulation of excess reserved CVEs. What you can take away? I know that, especially if you were at the CNA feedback session earlier, this was reiterated over and over again to request CVEs on an as-needed basis. But if some vulnerability information is public and you're not ready to publish the CVE information right away, you don't have to issue a CVE right away. If you have too many CVEs sitting around, especially if you rely on manual processes, it's the digital equivalent of this. You have a lot of resources available to you on a moment's notice, but it's really easy for information to get lost. and you have to go digging around to find it. It can be a bit of a pain compared to something that's smaller and more manageable. And if your organization is anything like mine, if you're an organization that issues a lot of CVEs, yeah, I've never noticed a problem with the API connection, but if your org is concerned about needing to have a buffer just in case of any outages, it's also totally fine to request smaller, more frequent batches of CVEs. You can think about how many CVEs does your org issue in a month, a week, a day, or if you just have one big project where you anticipate needing a lot of CVEs, that's also an option. Batches don't have to be the same size for each request. If you go through periods of time, like right after major disclosure events where there are a lot of CVEs, you can request more. If you go through a period of doldrums, like around the holidays, you can request fewer. The program is designed to be flexible, and your org can be flexible as well. However, there is a downside if you have information available publicly, but your org isn't ready to assign a CVE and get that information out to the CVE list just yet. Vulnerabilities that become public without a CVE being assigned to it immediately risk another CNA assigning a duplicate CVE. That CNA could let you know, but sometimes it just happens where another CNA assigns a CVE and they don't or can't get in touch with you to let you know that there's a CVE. This can lead to duplicates happening, and once again would lead to you and that other CNA needing to go through the deduplication process, which you can do. It's fine. It's just extra work. And to that end, populate your CVE records as soon as reasonably possible. I encountered the consequences of not publishing a CVE record in a timely fashion when I was working on clearing GitHub's reserved but public backlog in early 2023. This is a blog post from the security lab, which is the GitHub security lab is the larger team that I work on. And this blog post was published in December of 2021, which you may recognize as the time when my team and a lot of teams were wading waist deep in Log4j, and we didn't have a lot of incentive to publish things that weren't getting a lot of attention because we had to deal with this really big important stuff, and we were down people because we were losing our manager and we were going to have to get a new manager and all of those things. And that vulnerability had a CVE, but publishing it just slipped our minds. And once again, this was in the days we were using all manual processes that so just fell up and up and up the spreadsheet as we moved on to dealing with things that were more recent. We did eventually publish it in February of 2023. Better late than never. However, we got an email shortly after publication from another CNA that saw the blog post, did not see an associated CVE record, and decided to issue a CVE of their own. This publication happened about a year after we reserved the CVE. So I did have time to act, and I'm grateful that they reached out to initiate the deduplication process. They were smooth to work with, but I regret that this had to happen in the first place when I could have prevented the trouble for them by publishing CVE 2021 32850 to the CVE list in a more prompt fashion. Publishing CVE information ASAP has the added benefit of keeping information in newly published CVEs timely and actionable, and helps the CVE list for us all. On top of that, this is me griping a little bit about what happens to the holiday season of a CVE consumer when CNAs wait until the end of the quarter or year to publish. When deluges of records happen, it's a little bit difficult to deal with. But if the vulnerability is serious, something in that deluge could start an incident during a time of year when people really don't want incidents. Additionally, at the end of a quarter, like right now is the end of the quarter, and around Easter or around June 30th is common for vacations, or around the end of December is the holidays. A lot of times people on teams are gone for various holidays, and it can be a pretty substantial burden on the folks who are covering to have to deal with huge deluges of records. And rushing to publish large influxes of information increases the risk of publishing erroneous information, which I have made stupid typos and things like that because I was rushing to handle a deluge before. On the other hand, when things are published in a timely fashion, more or less as they come in, rather than waiting to publish in huge batches at the end of the year, that makes things smoother for those folks who have to deal with publishing the information. They don't have to go through a marathon session of publishing CVE information. The consumers of that information don't have to go through a marathon session of sorting through it. It's just a little bit nicer all around for everyone. Another helpful thing you can do, and this is a really good thing to bring up to your team when you get home with these new CVE CNA rules that are coming up, is having and enforcing a disclosure policy, preferably with some timelines or milestones that trigger publication of vulnerability information to a CVE list. If you're one of those organizations that uses a timeline, like if you're a research organization or if you're dealing with information in your own products, this could be 90 days after you discover a vulnerability or 30 days after the development of a fix, so folks have time to patch. When a patch is made available, if you're dealing with stuff from the public or open source, when the vulnerability becomes public knowledge, such as in a researcher blog, this is where that 72 hours mentioned in 4.5 of the new CVE CNA rules becomes relevant, because that gives you a nice solid timeline of when you need to have that information over to the CVE list. And especially if this is something that you don't do a lot because you're a smaller CNA, have playbooks and checklists for the necessary processes, especially if disclosure isn't routine, or if different folks are going to be handling it and you might need to train them quickly. And if you wear a lot of hats in your org and your org is small and spread thin and you have a lot of things to deal with, it's especially important to have these things written down and to have these written plans so that there isn't that question of what do I do now, and things don't get lost. Additionally, a good thing to check right now, but at any time of year, is to check if any CVEs that your org has reserved have been disclosed publicly, particularly if a researcher has come to you and said that there's a problem, or if you work in more of an open source ecosystem and information sometimes just gets out, because that is the nature of open source. I have lost my mouse cursor. Oh no. Oh, there it is. All right. So if you see this blog post, in this case, this was by someone who is internal to our org. So the communication probably should have been easier, but once again, log4j, this might also involve some external communication from someone outside of your org. And at least it shouldn't involve having to physically scroll up in the spreadsheet that you use to keep track of all of your CVE information. This, as long as there's something that doesn't involve human memory that can prompt that publication. So, lessons learned. What do I want all of you to take home from this lovely presentation today? First and foremost, the rules are there for a reason. The upcoming rules are there for a reason. Requiring making vulnerability information public in a timely fashion gives CNAs a guideline for how soon they should publish information. And keeping information timely empowers downstream CVE consumers to protect themselves. At the end of the day, this is what CVE is about. Staying on top of CVEs and preventing reserved but public CVE backlogs is less work than clearing backlogs. Once again, you can do it right, or you can do it right the second time. However, it is absolutely worth it if you are going from falling behind to being caught up. Whenever you get caught up, your org can do wonderful things, like when GitHub doesn't have piles of papers that have to be manually processed to worry about. You can see that those little signs that say used and collectible. GitHub was able to list a whole bunch of used records hanging around the warehouse, and now they're nice and neat and orderly and have prices, and they're for sale online, and the business can make more money rather than having to worry about handling miscellaneous records that are somewhere or handling miscellaneous papers that are somewhere. Beautiful things happen when you get caught up on your backlogs. Different CNAs can and should use different combinations of techniques so their orgs can minimize reserved but public CVEs in a way that works for them. The CVE program is designed to be flexible. Different CNAs are going to have different needs. And the whole point of having these multiple techniques is so your org can find something that works for you. And within the same CNA, the techniques that work best may change over time. In my org, we went from having to clear a backlog to just making sure we stay on top of things. Something to think about, and I've deliberately been a little bit, I've been pretty quiet on talking about the money question, but is it worth the time, money, and effort to develop automated tooling for your team if it means you have more timely and relevant information out there? I don't know your org. Maybe it's worth it. I happen to like working with automated tooling and feel that it helps me get more done as an employee, but this is something that your team is going to have to decide. And in fact, when it comes to reserved but public CVEs, we have a pretty happy story about how these new processes helped GitHub and someone who wanted to disclose a CVE. We got contacted by a researcher who said, I came to a maintainer and they were communicative initially, and then nothing happened. And it's been 90 days, and I want to publish this CVE, and it is out there. It is right here. Please populate the CVE record. You will notice that this became public on March 11th, 2024. And happy joyous ending right here. We were able to get the CVE record published on March 11th, 2024 to keep that information timely and relevant and have no duplicates. Because we were able to be timely, because we had this tooling, and because we had good communication with the researcher, we were able to get that information out there in a timely fashion. And this ended up being less work than it was dealing with that 2021 CVE that I didn't publish until 2023. And finally, the most important record of all. Sorry, the most important lesson of all. Clearing backlogs of CVE records for CNA pays way, way, way better than clearing backlogs of sales records for a small independent music distro. I'd like to thank all of my teammates at GitHub who helped me put this presentation together. In particular, I want to thank Jonathan Evans, who was really patient with me talking about the nuances of different types of reserved CVEs and reserved but public CVEs. And Jonathan spent so much time reviewing the new rules and pointing out things that would work for my presentation. He's been a tremendous resource this entire time, but every single person on my team helped me practice and gave me feedback and gave suggestions that I incorporated into this presentation. They've been awesome. And the overall GitHub Security Lab has been fantastic for providing resources and lessons that I learned from for this presentation. And speaking of folks that I learned from, who all's ready for a Q&A? Oh,
you so much for sharing your experience with us. What a story. We're going to open up for Q&A, everyone. Those on the Discord channel attending virtually, feel free to put your questions into the track 1 channel. I will read them out loud. Shelby will respond. And then for those attending in person, raise your hand. I will bring you the mic. You can ask Shelby your question and she will respond. All right. We're open.
I see Chris has his hand raised.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shelby. I had a quick question. So in my observation, particularly as a CNA, the one thing that kind of struck me, and I believe it was relatively recent, is that if you assign a CVE or you request a CVE one by one, you get a shorter ID overall. And that's some way an incentive to actually go and reserve one by one as you need, as opposed to in the past, we bulk reserve 100 CVEs at a time. So from my perspective, that was a very practical way to kind of incentivize that behavior. Do you think the CNA rules, the change, is that enough to, induce the change and have folks, actually reserve when they need and publish timely? Or do you think there's more that we should be doing?
I'm not sure if it's enough for everyone, but the fact that there are new rules coming up and the fact that these new rules state unambiguously 72 hours is going to help those folks who are responsible for developing their org's policies. And if that person who's responsible for those policies has buy-in and they come to their org and say, hey, these external folks say we have to do this, that's a much more powerful motivator than saying we should do this because we're good CVE citizens. Having clear expectations for everyone in the program is really helpful, and I think will help reduce those cases of CNAs that don't take action because they're not exactly sure what to do. Having clearer expectations overall is going to help those folks who want to do the right thing. I noticed that that the email address on the Q&A page and my Mastodon link got a little bit cluttered. So if anyone needs a little bit help reading that, that is security-advisories@github.com. That is the email address for the entire team. And I am on Mastodon. If you go to metalhead.club/scunning, you can reach me on the Fediverse. And I have my Mastodon profile open right now if anyone has questions for there. Discord is fine too. I'm just not in the VulnCon Discord.
From anyone else for Shelby?
Hey there. I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation, as I'm going to use these talking points when talking to CNAs under the CISA route about RBP cleanup.
Yay, thank you.
Any other questions for Shelby? All right, Shelby, if you're okay to end it here. No more questions in Discord or in the room. Thank you so very much for sharing your experience with us again. Let's give a round of applause for Shelby.